The moment I overheard my mom say, "Your brother, he's not getting a single dime," I already knew something was wrong. I stood frozen in the hallway, one hand still resting against the wall. My brother laughed from the dining room. Dad smirked. Not nervously, not awkwardly. He looked pleased, like they had finally decided my place in the family. And it was nowhere near the money I had spent years protecting. I watched Mom lean toward my brother and whisper something else. He grinned, then glanced toward Dad. They thought I hadn't heard. They were wrong. For years, I'd been the quiet one, the dependable son, the person who handled paperwork, protected investments, and never asked what was mine. Apparently, they had mistaken my silence for weakness. I walked past the dining room without saying a word. No argument, no accusation, not even a goodbye. I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and opened my laptop. The account showed $3,200. Money they assumed would eventually belong to my brother. Money they assumed I would simply leave untouched. That night, I made one decision. I moved every dollar I legally controlled. By morning, their world would be different. I was 38, the oldest of two brothers, and for most of my life, I had been the person my family called when something needed fixing. My younger brother Ethan was different. He was charming, impulsive, and somehow always forgiven. When he failed, Dad called it a lesson. When I succeeded, Mum called it responsibility. I learned early that being dependable came with an invisible price. People stopped noticing what you sacrificed. After college, I built a financial consulting firm from almost nothing. Dad helped me once, lending me a few $1,000s when I was starting out. I repaid him within 6 months, but somehow that small favor became family folklore. Whenever money came up, Dad reminded everyone that he had given me my start. What he never mentioned was everything afterward. The 18-hour days, the deals I walked away from, the investments I made when everyone else was afraid, the years I quietly built something worth protecting. By the time my company was acquired, my personal assets had grown beyond anything my parents understood. I never flaunted it. I still arrived at family dinners in the same old SUV. I still brought groceries when Mom hosted Thanksgiving. I still paid for Dad's medical bills without announcing it. And that was the mistake they made. They thought humility meant I had nothing. They thought because I never demanded recognition, I didn't deserve any. My brother eventually learned about the money, but he never learned where it came from. And my parents never realized that the $3.2 million they were discussing wasn't simply an inheritance waiting for them to divide. It was mine. After that evening, I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice. At Sunday dinner, Mom placed Ethan beside Dad and left me at the far end of the table. "Ethan understands family," she said casually, passing him the roast. I looked up. She smiled at him. Then she looked away. A week later, Dad asked me to review some investment paperwork. When I finished, he barely glanced at it. "Good," he said. "At least one of you knows what you're doing." Ethan laughed. I didn't. The little comments kept coming. When I mentioned a business trip, Mom asked why I was always chasing money. When Ethan bought a new car, Dad called it a smart investment. When I bought one, Mom said, "You don't need to show off." I began noticing the pauses, too. Whenever inheritance came up, conversations suddenly became quieter when I entered the room. Whenever Dad discussed the future, Ethan was included. I wasn't. One afternoon, I found Dad and Ethan standing in the study with an old leather folder between them. They stopped talking when I walked in. Dad closed it slowly. "Nothing important," he said. His eyes stayed on mine for half a second too long. I smiled. "Of course." But something had changed. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped volunteering information. And I started listening. At Thanksgiving, Ethan casually asked Dad whether the house and investments would be divided evenly. Dad looked toward Mom. Mom looked at Ethan. Then both looked at me. Nobody answered. That silence told me more than words could have. For the first time, I wondered whether my family had already made plans for a future that didn't include me. And quietly, I began preparing for one that didn't include them. The turning point came 3 days before Christmas. I arrived at my parents' house early and heard voices coming from Dad's study. The door was almost closed. I recognized Ethan immediately. "You said he wouldn't get anything," he said. Mom answered quietly, "He doesn't need it. Look at what he already has." Then Dad spoke. "He'll be fine. Ethan needs the house, the accounts, everything we can leave him." I stood perfectly still. Then Ethan asked the question that finally broke something inside me. "What about the 3.2 million? Silence. My stomach tightened. Dad chuckled. "That money will eventually come back into the family. Your brother has always been too trusting." He'll understand when the time comes. I understood. They weren't simply planning to exclude me. They had convinced themselves that what I owned was somehow available to them. I stepped into the hallway and walked toward the kitchen. Mum saw me. Her face changed for half a second. Then she smiled. "You're early." I returned the smile. I heard enough. Dad appeared behind her, suddenly serious. Nobody apologized. Nobody explained. Instead, Dad said, "Don't make this emotional." That sentence settled everything. For years, I had confused keeping peace with being respected. I had swallowed insults because they were family. I had paid bills because they were family. I had stayed silent because I believed family loyalty meant something. But loyalty without respect was simply permission to be used. That night, I went home and opened every financial document I had. The $3.2 million was legally mine. The accounts were under my control. There was nothing reckless about protecting my own property, so I made the decision quietly. I transferred the funds into accounts only I controlled. No threats, no revenge speech, just one boundary they had never expected me to enforce. And when the transfer completed, I closed my laptop. For the first time in years, I felt completely calm. I didn't wake up the next morning looking for revenge. I wanted certainty. Before moving another dollar, I called my attorney, someone who had handled my business acquisitions for years. I sent him copies of every document connected to the $3.2 million. He reviewed them carefully. Then he said the words I needed to hear. "You're the sole legal owner. Nobody else has a claim to these funds." I asked him to verify everything twice. Ownership records, tax documents, investment statements, beneficiary designations, every signature, every transfer. There would be no loopholes and no misunderstanding. Next, I contacted my financial advisor and instructed him to move the money into accounts, protected by stronger security measures and completely separate from anything my family could access. I didn't empty accounts that belonged to my parents. I didn't touch their property. I didn't fabricate evidence. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply secured what was already mine. Then I made one more decision. I would let them reveal themselves. My attorney advised me not to announce anything until every transfer was finalized and every document was properly recorded. So I waited. At family dinners, I smiled. When Dad asked about my finances, I gave him the same answer every time. Everything is fine. When Ethan joked about eventually taking care of the family, I simply changed the subject. They mistook my calmness for surrender. That was exactly what I wanted. Meanwhile, I quietly changed passwords, updated security questions, reviewed old authorization forms, and removed outdated access permissions. By the end of the week, nothing financial connected me to their plans. I didn't need to destroy my family. I only needed to stop allowing them to use me. The final step was the simplest. I waited for them to ask for the money, because when they did, I would finally have the answer they had never expected. No, the consequences began the next morning at 7:14. My phone vibrated across the kitchen counter. Then again. Then 5 times in less than a minute. I already knew who it was. Dad. I let it ring. A message appeared. "Call me now. What did you do?" I poured coffee and watched the morning light stretch across the floor. Another message arrived. "The money is gone." I took one slow breath. Then I called him. He answered immediately. "Where is it?" His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was frightened. I looked through the window at the quiet street. "Safe. You moved the entire account?" "Yes." "You had no right." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because those words sounded strangely familiar. "I had every right," I said calmly. "It's mine." There was silence. Then Mom came onto the call. "Your father has worked his whole life for this family. So have I." She didn't answer. Dad's voice hardened. "You're going to put everything back?" "No." One word, nothing dramatic, but it landed harder than an argument ever could. Ethan started shouting somewhere in the background. I heard him say, "He can't do this to us." I closed my eyes. There it was. Not concern for me, not regret. Just outrage that their plan had failed. I told them the money was legally mine. Every transfer had been documented. And my attorney had confirmed everything. Then I said the sentence I'd been waiting years to say. "You made plans for my future without asking me. Now I'm making plans for mine without asking you." I ended the call. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. For the first time, silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like freedom. By noon, the family group chat had become a battlefield. Messages appeared faster than I could read them. Aunts asked what had happened. Cousins sent private messages. One uncle called me selfish. Another quietly asked if the rumors were true. I didn't defend myself. I simply told the truth once. The $3.2 million was mine. I had never promised it to anyone, and I had never taken anything that belonged to my parents. That was enough. By evening, the story had traveled through the family, but something unexpected happened. People who had spent years assuming I was the difficult one began asking questions. Why had Mom and Dad expected my money? Why had Ethan believed he was entitled to it? And why had nobody ever asked me what I wanted? For the first time, the family wasn't discussing my success. They were discussing their behavior. Ethan stopped answering messages. Dad refused to speak to me. Mom sent one final text. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" I stared at those words for a long time. Then I deleted the message. Not because it didn't hurt, because I finally understood that guilt was the last tool they had left. The money changed nothing about who I was. It only revealed who everyone else had been. Some relatives apologized. Some disappeared. A few stayed silent because admitting the truth would have meant admitting they had watched it happen for years. And that was the real consequence. I didn't destroy my family. I simply stopped carrying it. Maybe that's why this matters. Sometimes revenge isn't making someone suffer. Sometimes it's refusing to sacrifice yourself just to keep people comfortable. And sometimes the strongest boundary is the one you finally stop apologizing for. Months passed before I realized how much lighter I felt. The 3.2 million was still there, untouched and secure, but strangely, that wasn't what mattered most anymore. For the first time, I wasn't measuring my worth by how useful I could be to my family. I stopped answering every emergency call. I stopped paying for things nobody appreciated. I stopped explaining why I deserved the life I had built. My relationship with Dad remained distant. Mum occasionally sent short messages, but they were different now. Less demanding, more careful. Ethan eventually apologized. Not for the money, for believing he was entitled to it. I accepted his apology, but I didn't pretend everything was suddenly repaired. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't require reopening a door. I began spending more time with people who celebrated me without calculating what I could give them. I traveled, I expanded my business. I donated to a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name. And every time I signed another document for the future, I felt something I hadn't felt at my parents' house in years. Peace. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked past that study door that night. Maybe I would have kept giving. Maybe I would have kept believing that silence was the price of belonging. But I heard the truth. And once you hear how people value you when they think you aren't listening, you can't unhear it. I didn't win because I kept the money. I won because I finally understood that my life didn't need their permission. They thought taking away my place in the family would leave me with nothing. Instead, they gave me the courage to build a life where I no longer needed a place at their table. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't taking something back, it's realizing you were never theirs to take.